And it's official, Final Fantasy XVI is happening, and we now have been treated to the game's incredible first trailer. Obviously, now the game has been confirmed, there is going to be much for us to discuss and talk about. So let's get things kicked off today with a brief overview of the project. Final Fantasy XVI is being developed by Square Enix's Creative Business Unit 3, and this is a completely different development team from those working on Final Fantasy VII Remake, so the two games should not impact the production of one another. The director of 16 is Hiroshi Takai, whose work on the franchise goes way back to Final Fantasy V, and the game's producer is none other than Naoki Yoshida, now long rumoured to be working on the previously unannounced 16th entry. Yoshida, or Yoshi P as his nickname goes, is often credited for being the man who effectively saved Final Fantasy XIV. After 14's disastrous launch back in 2010, Square Enix took the MMO offline completely and put Yoshi P, a self-professed workaholic, in charge of what at the time probably seemed to be an impossible task of salvaging the ashes from the fire. But he did so in fine form, and under Yoshida's leadership, Final Fantasy XIV has since been transformed into one of the most successful subscription-based MMOs that to this day retains a strong fan base and occupies a healthy chunk of Square's business. So Final Fantasy XVI is reassuringly in experienced hands, and based on that first trailer, it would appear there is certainly much to be excited about. Incidentally, despite Yoshida's extensive work on 14, Final Fantasy XVI will not be an MMO. It will be a traditional single-player experience in line with the majority of the other games in the franchise. Now, at this time, it is probably far too early to talk about release dates, but Takai has suggested in the Square press release that we may have quite the wait. I personally wouldn't expect the game until at least late 2021 at the earliest at this point, but it could even be after that, maybe going into 2022 or even beyond. Also, history leads me to believe that Final Fantasy XVI will be more than just a game. Final Fantasy XV, for example, had multiple other projects associated with it, including an entire movie. Final Fantasy VII Remake, as we know, is being released over multiple full-size games with currently no end in sight. Now, perhaps Square will go in a similar direction with 16, we simply don't know at this point, but I would definitely expect the project to end up being more than just a game.
Your father will be expecting us.
I am Joshua's shield. I'm sworn to protect him.
Regardless, Final Fantasy XVI will be released on PlayStation 5 as an exclusive. This has been confirmed. A PC release was also mentioned at the end of the first trailer, but this has now quickly been retracted by Square. But let's move on and talk about the world of Final Fantasy XVI itself. Now, of course, right now we simply don't know much, only gleaming what little we can from the trailer. But the first interesting observation is that the game is going to be taking us back to the fantasy roots of the franchise. Now, online rumours have long stated that 16 would be based in a medieval-styled setting, and indeed, those rumours have now been established to be the case. Interestingly, in a 2019 interview, Yoshida stated, "I'd like to see a Final Fantasy that is straightforward fantasy, one that doesn't have much machinery and with no mecha in it." Of course, these words were spoken before Yoshida's involvement in 16 was even confirmed, but in hindsight he was clearly telling us about Final Fantasy 16's setting in a very sneaky way. Well played, Yoshi P, well played. Now, other Final Fantasy staples such as summons and crystals are apparently going to be playing a substantial role here as well. The basic story seems to revolve around two kingdoms that are at war with one another, which may for some be an overused Final Fantasy trope by this point, but come on, we just don't know yet how things are going to play out here. One early theory is that the player will witness events from both sides, perhaps alternating control of a party from each kingdom. However, most of the gameplay action from the trailer seems to be focused upon this man. He appears to be a bodyguard for a youth named Joshua, who obviously is going to be a pivotal figure in the overarching story. And for those hoping that the traditional fantasy setting of the game may also have signalled a return to traditional gameplay, you might be disappointed, because the combat mechanics are clearly action-based in line with Final Fantasy XV and Final Fantasy VII Remake. However, combat in 7 Remake was definitely much improved over the combat in 15, and indeed now in 16, we can see that movement and actions are looking to be extremely fluid, with much fun to be had, I am sure.
Do they really mean to invade us?
Now, I briefly mentioned that summons are returning, and indeed it would appear that their role in 16 is going to be heavily story-based rather than just a cool battle feature. So, in the trailer we learn that summons in Final Fantasy 16 are actually known as icons, and these magnificent creatures are tied to specific individuals known as dominants. The trailer opens with what I suspect is probably the game's actual opening. A group of mercenaries or soldiers are on a mission to capture Shiva's dominant. Now, we don't know much about this dominant other than she is a girl, and we do not know at this time why they want to capture her. One thing that also isn't really clear is whether a dominant simply summons their icon, or whether they actually become the icon themselves. Now, I mention this because at one point in the trailer where Ifrit is summoned, he first appears as more ordinary sized but rather fiery looking, almost as if a normal person is being transformed into him. However, conversely, when Joshua calls Phoenix, it does materialise as a separate creature in the sky above. Fascinating stuff, you know, I can't wait to learn more. It should also be noted as well that Phoenix and Ifrit are likely those two beings present in the game's logo, indicating further the importance of the roles that icons and dominants are going to have within the story. So, this first trailer is without a doubt an epic tease from Square as to what we can expect from Final Fantasy 16, with the continued success of Final Fantasy 14, and of course with future releases of 7 Remake in active development. It seems there has perhaps never been a better time to be a Final Fantasy fan. But folks, I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts on Final Fantasy 16 based on what we have seen so far. And if you feel that I've missed something, then please do let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see future Final Fantasy 16 content. See you next time, guys. Take care.